they're making babies into the villains these days, right?
I just find it fascinating, this kind of morphing of truth and this morphing of villain versus hero.
The hero is willing to sacrifice themselves for the sake of others, the good for the sake of the good of others. The villain is willing to sacrifice others for the sake of their own good, you could say, or their own desire.
So it's this whole idea that a villain is justified in evil behavior if something bad happened to them, and that behavior often is not even directed at any party associated with the thing that happened to them.
Rick, the inventor guy, he's the villain.
Yeah.
He's like evil. He only cares about himself and his family, and then he doesn't care if he blows up planets, if he exterminates other races, but the whole time you're kind of rooting for him because, like, well, that's the protagonist. Hello, and welcome to the Pop Culture Contrarian podcast with Thomas Sterling and Andrew.
Hello.
Hey, everybody.
Today, our topic is, where have all the villains gone? We've noticed this trend in Hollywood, especially in the movies that are being pushed out today, where the villains seem to either sometimes not be there, sometimes they were right all along, sometimes it's like, oh, I see why they did what they did, it's not their fault. And pretty rarely these days you have someone who's a pure villain. But we also think this is part of a broader cultural trend that we're going to get into, but we'll start with the movie aspect of this. So I'm just going to start on, let's talk about some movies that don't really have villains. We've talked about two of these already. So Barbie and Top Gun Maverick. I think both of those qualify as not really having a villain. Do y'all disagree with me?
Well, in Barbie, certainly there's not, at least not a human, character.
Right.
I would say in Top Gun Maverick, though, there's kind of a faceless enemy.
Right. There is an enemy, but there's no villain. There's no life to them. There's no character to them. They're just literally covered in a black mask.
It's a figurehead. Just generic enemy B.
Right.
Well, in Barbie, the villain was the patriarchy, right?
Yeah, well, I think the patriarchy is the villain in every movie. What do y'all think about that? What do you think about movies with no villains? Clearly we liked Barbie. We liked Top Gun Maverick. So It's not that you can't make a good movie without a villain.
Oh, right. Yeah, certainly not. I mean, Barbie, it was kind of asking the question of life and exploring, the dynamics between men and women. I would say that the takeaway was we kind of are just stumbling through this together and we need each other, but we don't really know what's going on.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good encapsulation of the movie. And that's, sometimes that's the right movie to make.
Yeah.
But I do think there is a need to be able to draw the clear distinction. This guy's good, this guy's bad.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that Hollywood's losing that ability sometimes.
Yeah, the battle between good and evil, where it's definitely, and obviously so for the audience.
Mm-hmm. Sure. It depends on what kind of a movie you're trying to make. But the concern, I think, and we'll get to this, is when you are trying to make a distinct good and evil movie and you're aligning those dynamics in concerning ways.
Right. One movie that I just always think of when it comes to, hang on, you maybe didn't quite portray your villain right.
Right.
Is the Black Panther movie that came out in 2018. Because the villain in that movie, the way society sees it today, Killmonger was just right about just about everything except killing his cousin. Other than that, he was right about everything he did, because his uncle, the king, kind of betrays him from his point of view. He comes back, he takes over the kingdom, and then he starts trying to free from oppression all black people everywhere on Earth by violence. So okay, if you just didn't do the violence, then you'd be good on all fronts. And he's supposed to be the villain. We're supposed to be rooting for T'Challa in that movie. We're not supposed to be rooting for Killmonger. So it seems like maybe they need to, figure out how to draw that dichotomy better.
Indeed.
Yeah, well, I guess what that would present is a character that's, you could say, well-intentioned, but they're willing to do evil to arrive at the desired, quote, good outcome. But I mean, I think generally speaking, that is, for most people, even people who do evil, that's a way of justifying it for them. Well, I had a good reason for it.
Right. The ends justify the means.
Right. The old Machiavellian ethic there.
Right. And I think from our point of view, from the Christian point of view, that's just not the case. The ends do not justify the means. The means have to be just.
Yeah, and it's because we're not omniscient.
Right. Yeah, we don't see all the outcomes of what we're doing. We don't.
We can't see how everything's going to work itself out. And
but also
to take on such a kind of like a hubris to say, well, I knew what was the best. I knew what the end needed to be, and so I was willing to
knowingly do evil.
Yeah, do evil.
And I think that's the real Christian sticking point. Besides just omniscience and not having it, it's I can't choose to do something evil. Right.
Well, I think with that point being established, why don't we lay out the different types of villains that we're seeing in movies right now, and then dig into how they're different from the clear, distinct, this is an evil person doing wrong things for the wrong reasons, and they are fallen. From the Christian perspective, they're doing it because they're fallen and they're evil and they've chosen that path.
Yeah.
Why don't we kind of dig into the categories of what we're seeing in Hollywood and how those villains that we see diverging, where are they going?
Yeah. Okay, so we started with one of the categories already, which is the kind of the lack of a villain, the no villain, the Barbies, the Top Gun Mavericks. Some Disney movies have fallen into this. Encanto, which is one of their recent movies, Moana, another one. There's not really a villain. There's just people who've kind of been wronged, and it all ends up working out in the end. Then you have another category where I think it's they're a villain, but it's not their fault. They didn't want to be a villain. Society made them, kind of thing. Or maybe not society, but the situation around them. I would think that in that category you have movies like Ant-Man and the Wasp, where the villain ghost in that movie is just a girl who had a terrible thing happen to her as a child, and it gave her an ability that she now uses to kill people. And she's like trying to seek justice for herself, but the way she does that is by killing people. But nonetheless, the way the movie presents it is kind of like, oh, don't you feel for her? Don't you understand why she's doing what she's doing? It's like, well, she's killing people.
So it's this whole idea that a villain is justified in evil behavior if something bad happened to them. And that behavior often is not even directed at any party associated with the thing that happened to them.
Exactly. Almost always you'll see in these movies, they'll end up going after somebody who's only like tangentially related to whatever happened to them. Other movies in that category are like Thor, Love and Thunder, or Thor 4, the Batman. Now, Batman's an interesting category because I feel like with most Batman villains, there's always some explanation because Gotham is just such a hellhole of corruption that any villain or, anyone who kills a public figure in Gotham, the chances of them having been corrupt are like 99%.
Right. Yeah.
So especially in the Batman movie, you definitely felt that way with the Riddler killing only corrupt people the whole time throughout the movie. Then you have another category where you do have the pure villain, where it's just like, they're villainous. We wrote villain and we sought somebody who could play just villain, no nuance here. So I think a great example of that is Guardians of the Galaxy 3 from last year, because the villain in that movie is the guy who made Rocket Raccoon, who's one of the 5 Guardians of the Galaxies, or 5, however many there are. And his whole shtick is he turns animals into intelligent beings and then he kills them. So it's like, okay, no, you're just a bad guy. No one's really...
Yeah. And he's not seen in the film as redeemable.
No, he's heartless and definitely a psychopath in the movie. Just does not feel for anyone who's not him. And then, like I said, with Black Panther, you have the category of like the villain was right. Like they were doing the right thing, but they were nonetheless the villain because the movie told us so, kind of thing. And you have Black Panther. We have a few other examples, but those are from long enough ago that, Blade Runner, sure, the replicants are kind of just saying, maybe let us live.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are the categories. And then there are many other kinds of villains. We have talked about kind of, there's some where man is the villain or tech is the villain. And that'd be like, man would be the villain in a movie like The Happening where the plants kill everybody. And tech would be the villain in like iRobot or Terminator or something like that. So what do y'all think about this trend of this kind of softening of evil? Or the I think it's a transposition of evil from, it's no longer a person who's evil. No person can be evil, seemingly. It's always the situation or the structure or the society or whatever.
Well, I think that it's evident as it plays out in reality. And I wonder how much of that is influenced because of the stories that are more prevalent in Hollywood now. But a good example would be the BLM riots and the whole oppressor-oppressed dynamic, and the concept of, because the system is rigged or the system is oppressive or whatever, it makes it justified for me to go out and do violence or destruction or crime or whatever.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it necessarily justifies it, but it excuses it at the very least.
I think excuses is a good term.
Yeah, probably a better word.
Yeah, I think we're in an era where we're kind of, maybe Hollywood is kind of leaning more into, we would say, the victim dynamic. And in other words, if everywhere we look, we're seeing victims, and the status of the victim has now been raised almost to this kind of like, you're in a position, by being a victim, you're now in a position to be able to speak to society or speak to things. It's like a way of making you an expert.
Well, it's like a virtue. If you are a victim, that's a virtue you have.
Yeah.
And anyone who's exceptional in a virtue, you want to hear from.
Yeah,
right?
the virtuosity
anyone who's exceptionally
of the victim.
wise, anyone who's exceptionally strong, you want to hear them talk on their virtue.
So the virtue is associated with being a victim, not being virtuous or being someone who's actually done something good.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that kind of a dynamic, when you're looking at exploring the villain and those types of things, you're also going to be sympathetic toward, well, what may have made them the villain, because you're not necessarily saying they in and of themselves are so corrupt that they did this. You're kind of looking and saying they themselves in one sense are a victim of something, and they're just acting out in a way and it's hurting other people, which is a true reality of the human existence, right? People victimize, or as the saying goes, hurt people hurt people.
Yeah, I think that hurt people is basically I may be getting into theological thin ice here, but I think that's kind of the idea of original sin, is that originally someone sinned, and then that pain, that hurt has propagated throughout to all humanity. You can't escape the sin of your ancestors, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, but the corruption is part of that you inherit.
Yeah.
So I think when you're, and I guess you could say this with Hollywood, we're in this process where Hollywood is intentionally, we talk about it all the time with the whole woke narrative, they're intentionally trying to engage in pushing or changing our values.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so in that, the type of villains that are going to be written into those types of stories are going to be different from the old villains. Like with their value system, if the value system that was from the past that we're rejecting now and we're introducing a new value system, then the villains from the past and what they valued might not be villains anymore in the present.
Yeah.
So I think the easy way around that, though, is society is the ultimate villain, you could say.
Right. And that seems to me what a lot of these movies are saying. The Batman, again, it's Gotham's society. That's the villain. I would say the Joker movie is a great example of society being the villain. The character Joaquin Phoenix plays is horribly mistreated by society because he's got this mental deficiency or whatever it is. And he identifies society as the problem and the thing he needs to destroy in the movie, I think. That's how I see that.
Yeah, agreed completely. He sees it as the enemy. Another element to this may also be the your truth idea. Of course, the your truth idea it's a bit of a paradox, because while you're acting in your truth, you're also at the same time saying my actions are justified because of somebody else's truth interfering with my truth.
When truth, it devolves to desire or opinion, which is effectively what you're saying. What's right for me, quote, is then classified as truth or my views are truth to me. And it's a way of actually dodging real truth. Right? Yeah. If you can say that's not true to me, if it is a truth claim, you're either going to have embraced it and recognize it as so, or you're rejecting it. And And the excuse of this kind of this postmodern society we're in, where we've kind of even
that's not my lived experience.
Well, yeah, we've raised questions as to even the nature of truth, but we're trying to say there is no overarching meta narrative that impacts all of us. We're all our own little.
Yeah, it's so now we're talking about truth, and it seems far afield from villains, but we don't think it is.
No,
we think it's the same basic idea that we're seeing here, where if there's no truth, then there's no right and there's no wrong.
Mm-hmm.
If 2 + 2 can equal 5, then why is what that character did a wrong thing to do?
And so then you find yourself with villains who are actually praised.
You're right. Yeah.
Well, what's in that kind of context is if it's always society's fault, well, society is made up of people, created by people. And so
if every human is a victim of the society that they make up,
right,
is that not just the same thing as saying everyone's evil?
I know. Newsflash. I think that what I'm wondering, this is just me kind of debating a little bit on this topic. If we've gotten used to the societies at fault, the way to fix it is fix society. We've heard this over and over and over again.
It's never fix yourself.
People,
it's fix society.
People aren't evil. Society's evil, right? That only goes so far because you run into how did society get here? Because people make society, so there had to be somebody that was evil that made society evil, right?
Right.
And now, I think we have seen this tipping point to that point. So now there's a segment of society that is now being blamed for why society is evil.
Yeah.
In our culture, it's white men.
Yeah.
We, quote, created this culture, and this culture is supposedly terrible.
I would actually say that the people who are really at fault are dead white men.
Okay. Well,
and the only virtue they have is they're not alive white men.
I'll go with you on that. And so now we've got a villain who actually can't defend themselves.
Yeah.
So everyone will be classified as a villain who actually lionizes or appreciates those past villains.
Well, and anyone who says the society we have is good.
Yeah.
That must automatically you're a villain. If society is evil and you say society is not, then that makes you a villain.
So when we look at this classification of the villains, we're asking where the villains have gone. It's more of a question maybe of where the villain's going.
Yeah.
Because they'll never leave us.
Right. They're kind of shifting form. Yeah.
Right.
Trying to disguise themselves. Like we're kind of in the next phase of the devil trying to convince us he doesn't exist kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, we did look it up earlier, but the famous reference in Isaiah, woe to those who call evil good and good evil.
Yeah, you kind of.
Are we? It feels like in some ways, as a culture, are we in this process of doing just that? Where what would have been 30 years ago, culture would have said that's bad. Now, it's coming to a point where it feels like it's the exact opposite. And if you dare to say that's bad, you're bad.
Yeah, yeah. Not quite what you're talking about here, but it's kind of an interesting thought experiment. In the movie Oppenheimer, which we have as having a pure villain, we categorize the villain, and that is pure villain because Robert Downey Jr. plays this guy who's he's out for his own career, and anything he has to do to anybody is worth it if it furthers his career. But interestingly, just based on what you had just said, I was thinking about Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer's the one who makes the nuclear bomb.
Yeah.
And he's the hero? Hang on. Like, the movie does portray it that way, and I don't think it's wrong, but it is like some cognitive dissonance there, that the guy who created nuclear weapons is the hero.
We covered that in our show for Oppenheimer. It asked the question, is he a hero or not?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, he was, in one sense you could almost say he was both hero and villain.
Yeah.
Because
he was hero immediately and villain for the long term.
Yeah.
Well, I think it was almost him trying to ask himself that question.
Yeah, that's definitely what that movie is. It's one of the themes of the movie, for sure. Yeah.
So I think the pure villain one is a interesting category. Of course, I think that would have been more of a common type of movie motif, I would have argued, in like the 80s.
Yeah. I mean, I think most of the classic movies you watch from before the 80s, the villain's just a villain. Like, they have some nefarious plot and they're just trying to carry it out.
Well, I mean, I was thinking through, or let me just do it this way. TV programs, a lot of the sitcoms or shows, especially from the 80s, like the A-Team. There's always the villain, right? And the villains were whatever it was. They were greedy for something, or they wanted power or something like that. And so they were always abusing others to do that. And it was very simple, basic, and the A-Team existed to right the wrongs.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yep.
And that every week, that's what they did. And,
Pay the fool.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And there was a whole lot of shows throughout the 80s and 90s, but especially the 80s, where that was just a basic setup. It was good versus evil. The good guys seek justice and to bring retribution to the bad guys. That was just over and over and over again. And then you start asking questions that start happening, and especially as full board today, where people are actually, well, who are really the bad guys? Yeah. Are there really bad guys?
So on that topic and thinking about TV shows put me onto something I hadn't thought about before, but the TV show Rick and Morty, which I think I've mentioned a few times, it's an animated show. It's extremely clever. Like, it has very, very clever humor in the show. But it's about this grandpa who's the genius to end all geniuses. He can invent anything he wants with a pickle and a screwdriver.
Can move through time.
That's easy for him, but he also has a portal gun where he can just shoot a portal, walk through to any other place, any other universe, anywhere he wants. He's essentially omnipotent and omniscient. But if you actually watch the show, Rick, the inventor guy, he's the villain.
Yeah.
He's evil. He only cares about himself and his family. And then he doesn't care if he blows up planets, if he exterminates other races. But the whole time you're kind of rooting for him because, that's the protagonist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's an interesting example, I think, of I hadn't even realized it, of rooting for the villain.
Yeah, that's a good observation. It's easy to root for the villain when the villain is doing stuff that you would want to do.
Right, yeah. If I could, invent a time machine with a pickle and a screwdriver, I would love that. That'd be great.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's kind of another disguise, too, is how often are the villains doing things that everyone else would kind of like to do. Yeah. More of a traditional villain would be doing heinous things that any normal person would balk at and would be disgusted by. But then when the roles start to kind of haze and they're morphing and they're not clear, and you see the villain doing these things that you're like, sometimes I feel like doing that.
Yeah.
I think for a villain and a hero, or any of these dynamics that are, part and parcel to storytelling, you have to have them if you're going to tell a good story for the most part. You also have to have an understood, society-wide, agreed on morality.
Yeah, there has to be some touchstone where everyone can say...
Everyone has to see, stealing is always wrong.
Right.
And everyone has to recognize that, agree with that. And so then if the villain is going about stealing and then yet justifying it or excusing it by saying, but I'm poor, or something like this, we can say, well, yeah, but you're still wrong. And if you're doing it just for the pleasure of doing it, which I think is even really the truest definition of the
evil act,
the real evil act in the effectively the irredeemable villain, right? Mm-hmm. They're doing the evil because they like doing the evil. It's not just because, well, I had this, I was a victim of this or something like this, and I'm acting out because it's I like stealing. I like hurting people. I like this. It's something it's that type of villain that are the really true villains that you occasionally do see in movies. And those are the ones, I think, because...
Seems we're seeing less of those, really, is the point.
I don't know if we ever saw a lot of them, to be honest.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I think you probably saw more cut and dry villains in the past. I think Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life, he's heartless, doesn't care about anybody except money.
Right.
I think that's the kind of villain you would have seen a lot back then.
Yeah, maybe in the ones where I think maybe what it is there was less exploration of the reason for the villain. Mm-hmm. You could just say the villain just loves evil, and then that's all you have to put, and there's no more delving into the villain's character in that sense.
I agree. I think, I don't know the thing is, we do still get movies with pure villains today.
Yes,
it still does happen. We get all kinds of villains, but we're seeing more of the less pure, of the non-pure villains, of the it's not their fault, there's no real villain kind of thing.
Right, but you're also seeing the same for the hero. The hero is less pure.
Right. Yeah. But, well, kind of related to that, hi, I'm Sterling. If you've met me, you know I'm going to talk about Star Wars. So I'm going to talk about Star Wars. So in Star Wars...
Here we go.
In the original trilogy, you have two villains, right? You have more, but there's two real ones. You have Darth Vader, and you have Emperor Palpatine.
Yeah, the real villain.
The real villain is Emperor Palpatine.
But you don't find out until later.
You don't find out until, well, you get a hint of it in Empire when you're like, oh, Vader serves somebody.
Right.
Yeah, but then Return of the Jedi, it's like, oh, he just wants to make Luke suffer and turn him... Okay, he's just bad because he enjoys it. But that's an interesting example, because you have Vader who... You can't say it's not his fault after watching the prequels, but you can say, this is a line I'm stealing from another book series. Some people fall from grace. Some people are pushed. Darth Vader was pushed.
Yeah.
You know, Palpatine took him up right to the cliff's edge and then pushed him over. But then you have Palpatine, and he's just like, let's blow up planets. That sounds fun.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to rise through the Senate and take everything for myself and then take over everything because I want to.
Right. But even though with Vader, like, you understand his actions, especially if you've watched the prequels and the Clone Wars show, there's no point where you're like, oh, I get why he's doing, like I empathize with him doing this. Like, him killing all the other Jedi, him executing younglings, him torturing Princess Leia, cutting off Luke's hand. Like, you're never like, oh, Vader's misunderstood.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the whole time, he's a villain. Like, there's a reason he always makes the top 10 list of all greatest villains of all time. Mm-hmm. It's because he's villainous.
Yeah.
He is a twisted and wounded and kind of tragic figure, but he's a villain.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is the difference, where now if you had somebody like that, it would be, you would empathize with them the way they would be shown on film.
Yeah, they may have been victimized, but the deeper question is, well, what have they done with their experience or their trauma? And some choose to take that and traumatize others.
Yeah.
The hurt people dynamic. Others take that, and there's either there's the example, they hurt themselves or they rise above. The hero, because the hero narrative is often a narrative that comes, like, the hero doesn't have it all great the whole time.
Right.
Often the hero has tragic circumstances they rise up out of, but what makes them different from the villain in that situation is, and this is where you see a lot of in the comic books, kind of, the superhero has experienced terrible things.
Yeah.
But instead of choosing evil, they've chosen good.
I think a good example of this is a movie you brought up earlier, Shazam.
Yeah.
Where you have the villain is a guy who was offered all these wonderful powers to basically make him Superman, and he didn't have a pure enough heart, so he got sent back. And he had a dad and his brother who were, like, making fun of him, but he grows up just totally resentful because he wasn't given this power, and he finally gets his hands on power, and he uses it to kill his dad and his brother. And then the hero of that movie is just a kid who's an orphan and raised in the foster system, and he's granted all this power, and he by the end of the movie, he shares it with his new foster family, and you know, he maintains empathy and sympathy for other people despite what he's gone through. Even in the movie, like, he finds his birth mom and she rejects him again, and then he still goes out and acts in a heroic manner.
Yeah, it's almost a difference between self-love, which is the villain, versus love of others, which is the hero. The hero is willing to sacrifice themselves for the sake of others, the good, for the sake of the good of others. And the villain is willing to sacrifice others for the sake of their own good, you could say, or their own desire. I
think that's a great way to put it. And I think that's the line that's being blurred.
Yes.
Where it's now in society, not in movies. Now I'm talking about society. Now in society, you see the idea of others need to sacrifice for the good of everybody, not I need to sacrifice for the good of everybody. And that difference alone is almost the stereotypical definition of a hero versus a villain. If you're saying, oh, you know, all this has been done wrong, and because of that, the billionaires need to give up all their money, well, you're not taking the responsibility onto yourself where it belongs. That's what a hero does. A villain puts the responsibility on someone else. The hero takes it for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent point.
Yep.
All right. So what about, let's see, I'm looking at the categories we have. What's this second to last one? The villain was right. So that one, I think, is one that maybe, do you think that's a category that we're going to see more and more of? Or do you think that's just kind of a limited one that just is always kind of been? But
I think we're seeing more of it for sure in the past decade. I haven't seen all these movies, but I know the core of the movies. So like they made, the classic Disney movie 101 Dalmatians. Is there any villain more villainous than Cruella de Vil, who wants to take puppies, raise them until they get big enough, and then kill them and skin them for fur coats?
I mean, her name isn't. It's almost like Cruel Devil.
It's Cruel Devil, yeah. And then they made a movie where she's the hero, titled Cruella. I haven't seen the movie, but I know that she comes off as a hero. She doesn't kill any animals in that movie. But it's like, you're taking like almost the purest villain Disney has and turning them into a hero? And then like Maleficent, which is the evil witch from Sleeping Beauty. She's had 2 movies now explaining how, she was just done wrong and people hated her for her power. And so she had to kind of adopt this persona of the evil person.
There's one point I want to make, I think, in regards to one of these categories. And we had previously put the movie The Joker, the villain from the movie The Joker,
in the Not Their Fault.
Not Their Fault. But, and kind of rethinking it, maybe it would be better to categorize him in the villain was right. In the current kind of, you could say, cultural climate we find ourselves in today.
Yeah.
I mean, he was abused, he was bullied, dealt a bad hand. In one sense, he is kind of going out and getting, you could say, justice for himself and those he represents.
Well, and society's the villain, right?
Yeah, society is the villain in Joker. That's a good point.
Yeah. So he's turning on society.
Yeah.
Which is the heroic.
He's kind of exposing society for being the villain. Like you said, he's like effectively he's the one that's holding up the mirror to say, see, you guys are actually the bad guys.
Yeah. And the mirror in this case is a gun to a news reporter's head.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think going off of that, but also sort of an end point where I see all these different variations on villains going kind of ends in an idea of the devil himself is actually misunderstood and he is actually right. And in fact, there are a few movies and shows that have come out recently where that is literally the case.
Right. Yeah. They do have a trend of depicting the devil as the hero these days.
I think there's actually was it a TV show or a movie?
Lucifer. Yeah, it's a TV show.
And then the end of it, it's like you're almost endeared to him.
Well, you get endeared to him in episode 1. Like, he's just charming.
Yeah. And isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Because...
Charming devil.
Yes. Satan, he is the angel of light. And he comes deceptively. And so I just find it fascinating that this kind of morphing of truth and this morphing of villain versus hero, and then ultimately to this, the villain's just misunderstood, kind of moves in the direction of, the devil is actually misunderstood and he's actually right. And so then wrong is right. And it works directly into your Isaiah reference, Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, if you get to the point where the devil's not evil, then what on earth do you have left?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Andrew. All right. Well, so what have we talked about today? We've talked about all these categories of villains. There's some we didn't include, but the ones we have are there's no villain in the movie, or, there's a villain, but they're faceless. It's not the fault of the villain. It's just the situation necessitates them doing what they're doing. They're a pure villain, and they just like hurting people. That one you do still see some of, but I think you're seeing more of the other kinds nowadays. And then the villain was actually right all along, as you just said, with Joker. And the other example we had was Killmonger and Black Panther, yeah. And then we talked about society and what we see this kind of morphing into and where it's coming from, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's like, society, we are seeing it in reality, like how society is reacting to it. And then also the whole idea of like society is the villain.
Yeah. Right.
And, it's like the green agenda or the anti-child agenda.
Right. they're making babies into the villains these days, right? Like, you get pregnant, that's the end of the world. And so you're justified in doing whatever it takes to stop the end of the world. In this case, killing the baby.
Well, the villain is anything that gets in your way of living how you want.
Yeah. That seems like the way it's going. That's where the villains are going, because that's our question, right? Where have all the villains gone, or where are they going?
Yeah.
They're going to anything that you don't like, basically.
Yeah. I have seen the enemy and he is me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good line. All right. Well, this has been the Pop Culture Contrarian podcast with Thomas Sterling and Andrew. We're brought to you by the Patriot Post, which is the oldest online conservative news digest. It's still existent, and it is right. It's free. We hope you'll like and subscribe. And hey, leave us a comment. Let us know what you think and what we should be doing about all these symptoms we're identifying. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.